Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So I recently covered the basics of multiclassing, like when to consider jumping from your current class, how many levels you should dip, and the reason I did this is because multiclassing can be really effective, or it can be catastrophic if we jump before getting those primary features. At least catastrophic in regards to mechanics. I say that because I do interact with players who explain that they don't care when's the best time from an optimization standpoint to stop being a druid and start being something else. They were playing their character in their game, and something came up in the story and the development of their character where they thought, it just makes sense for me to multiclass into rogue. And it didn't matter to them that level 4 was not the optimal point to leave druid, and if it means their character contributes less mechanically, that's not really a concern to them. Or maybe they multiclass from sorcerer into barbarian, which is a really strange combination, of course, and as well is not all that mechanically optimal. And you know what, fair enough. Any way to play D&D that is fun for you and your DM and the other players at your table is a valid way to play the game. However, if you're even a bit of an optimizer, as I am, I could just never mix two classes that didn't work at least moderately well together. Or could I? I mean, at the end of the day, I like to take a concept and then optimize it within the restraints of that concept. And then I come up with a way to do that as well as make a reasonably effective character. That's something that's actually more rewarding to me than following our tried and true character builds. Now, I only briefly talked about what the standard pairings of classes are in those multi-class videos. I was more focused on the numbers of levels to take in each class. In a nutshell, pairing multiple caster classes, or martial classes, or a caster with a martial, all that doesn't really matter. It's pretty easy to come up with pairings that complement each other regardless. All you need to do is figure out what you want your character to be able to do, and who you want them to be, and then you find the mechanics across the classes and subclasses that go together to bring that character that you're imagining into the game. Now that's easy to do if you're pairing two classes that require the same ability score. So if you're envisioning a mage who dabbles in technology, artificer and wizard blend seamlessly. If you're envisioning a roguish type who is also an expert marksman, fighter and rogue can fit together with no problems at all. And of course, if you're envisioning your mage with a magic source from the divine that enters a pact with a mysterious entity from the Shadowfell, hey, wait a minute, you're not fooling anyone. I mean, if you want to play a Hexblade Divine Soul Sorcerer, play one. But either admit that the concept didn't come first, or do some kind of reskinning so that that does fit your concept. But back on topic. In those examples where those ability score priorities are exactly the same, it all comes together really easily. When it gets more challenging is when those ability score requirements just don't quite match. For example, let's look at multiclassing the ranger class with the cleric class. If we would look at the multiclass requirements, both have a wisdom requirement, so that matches up. And it is a decent combination, but not quite perfect. Rangers need both a dexterity and wisdom of 13 to multiclass, but if we're looking optimally, these ability scores aren't of even value in terms of ranger. It's very likely that we're concentrating on dexterity and then we're treating wisdom as a secondary priority. Now if we multiclass into cleric, and with cleric, wisdom is going to be far more important than dexterity, so there's a bit of a conflict there. Then when we actually get an ability score increase, we have a tough decision to make. If we increase our dexterity, our cleric features are being left behind. But if we focus on wisdom, our ranger features are being left behind. And it's not even that easy, because assuming we're using feats, we might not be increasing ability scores at all. Instead, we want feats that complement what we do. But the feats that tend to complement clerics and rangers are entirely different. And you don't get a lot of ability score increases. When you optimize a character build, determining when you're going to get access to those feats that you consider essential to your build, it's often the most challenging aspect of the entire build process. I cannot count the number of times I've worked on a build, then abandoned it, because I couldn't figure out the mix of ability scores, ability score increases, and feat selections to make it fulfill the role that I had envisioned for it. That doesn't mean we can't make a ranger and cleric work in a multi-class. It just means it's a bit harder than, say, a warlock and sorcerer. You need to make some decisions. So I want my character to focus on archery with some spellcasting to back it up. Okay, so are there some cleric subclass features that can complement that? For sure. The bonus action attack from War Cleric might complement a build that hasn't taken Crossbow Expert, so maybe we start with Sharpshooter instead, and then we leverage that feature. Then, the plus 10 to hit bonus from Channel Divinity could easily offset the minus 5 from Sharpshooter, at least occasionally. The Blessings of the Forge feature from the Forge Cleric could provide a plus 1 magic weapon if we didn't have one, and in a campaign where the DM has us tracking ammunition, Artisan's Blessing will be massive, allowing us to make arrows very, very quickly. And those examples are even before looking at Peace and Twilight domains, which, are overpowered, so obviously they're good. Then we look at spells. Well, Bless is an obvious choice. That D4 to attack rolls will be a nice boost. Shield of Faith could bolster our armor class. Spiritual Weapon could provide a bonus action attack if we don't have one. Domain spells like Spike Growth from Nature Cleric could keep ranged enemies at bay. So once we find some cleric features that complement our archery focus, the build can work just fine. Likewise, if our intended focus is leaning into the cleric spellcasting, we can look for the ranger options that complement that. For example, if our intention is to focus on Spirit Guardians, the Gloomstalker's ability to not be seen by dark vision might provide the defensive boost we need. Or maybe we use a Halfling Beastmaster, and we ride a Flying Beast Companion 10 feet above our enemies, so that our Spirit Guardians hits them, but they're limited to range attacks against us. Or Swarmkeeper, to use our Gathered Swarm feature to move enemy creatures we hit with our attacks into our Spirit Guardians, allowing for triggering that spell's damage multiple times each round. Then Ranger spell options, like Long Strider or Plant Growth, might give us the mobility advantage over enemies that work so well with the Spirit Guardian spell. So it's not as easy to mix something like Ranger and Cleric as it is to mix something like Warlock and Sorcerer, but it's totally doable. Where it becomes even more of a challenge is when we're looking at two classes where the ability scores don't match up at all. And we should at least acknowledge that ability scores are not made even, particularly when we're discussing multiclassing. The big winner for ability scores when it comes to multiclassing is Charisma. Whether you're looking at Warlocks, Sorcerers, Paladins, or Bards, there is a good chance that Charisma is first and foremost on your priority list. There's Paladin builds that might prioritize Strength, but just because of the massive impact of Aura of Protection, Paladins have lots of reasons why they might want to make Charisma their number one ability score. That's why Hexblade dips on Paladins are popular, because if you can also swing your weapon using Charisma, there's little reason to have a Strength score higher than the 13 required for the multiclass in the first place. But right behind Charisma, we have Dexterity. The thing about Dexterity is, it's not always the first priority of a character build, but it often is. If you're making an archery character, unless you're using some kind of loophole like Hexblade, then Dexterity is likely a primary ability score. If you're making a finesse-based melee character, as we see fairly often with rogue builds and occasional ranger builds, again Dexterity is primary. But the thing about Dexterity is that in addition to that, there is a good chance that it's at least the second priority for your wizard or your sorcerer or your warlock or your druid or your bard. Dexterity affects the armor class for any build that doesn't wear heavy armor and everyone's initiative whether they do or not. By far, if we want a multiclass, prioritizing in Dexterity, Charisma, or both can provide several multiclass options. Then there's the ability scores where fitting in at least a decent score is pretty easy. Constitution may not be a multiclass requirement for any class, but regardless of what class you are, you probably want it on at least the higher side. Wisdom is another one. It's tough to dump. Wisdom saving throws are a common save. Perception is based on wisdom and is probably the most common skill check. And we have at least two classes where it's going to be the top priority, and at least one more where it's the second from the top. Monk blurs that line a bit because it's hotly debated whether it's more important for them to focus on Dexterity or Wisdom. Intelligence is a bit tougher though. Yeah, we have Wizards and Artificers, and they definitely both want Intelligence to be their primary score. But lots of other classes are probably just best off dumping Intelligence. Though there are some subclasses like Psi Warriors, Arcane Tricksters, and Eldritch Knights that can also benefit from high Intelligence scores, giving some obvious options for multiclassing your Wizard or Artificer with Fighter or Rogue. Strength, though, when it comes to multiclassing, is probably the most difficult. Arguably, the only class that really requires a good Strength is Barbarian. Yeah, it's still common to have Fighters and Paladins that prioritize Strength, but neither of these classes need to prioritize Strength. And I would say quite often with optimized builds, they don't. I find archery fighters more common than melee ones, and Paladins, as mentioned, can get away with prioritizing Charisma, especially with that Hexblade dip. And bards, clerics, druids, monks, rogues, sorcerers, warlocks, wizards, they're all almost always dumping strength. I left rangers off that list because you can make a strength-based ranger, otherwise known as the stranger, but even that isn't an easy build to make work well. And with most ranger builds, strength gets dumped. And that informs the builds we tend to see with multiclassing. There's the super easy multiclass builds we all know work well. The Paladin Warlock, the Warlock Sorcerer, the Paladin Sorcerer, the Paladin Warlock Sorcerer, the Paladin Bard, the Paladin Bard Sorcerer, the Paladin Warlock Bard Sorcerer. I'm sure I missed something there, but charisma plus charisma plus charisma equals character build. Then there's Artificer Wizards, Ranger Rogues, Fighter Barbarians. Then there's the slightly harder but not all that uncommon multiclasses like Wizard Fighters or Druid Rangers. There's a lot more, Cleric Druids, Paladin Fighters, and the list goes on. However, there are just some combinations we never see. I don't remember if I've ever seen a Fighter Druid, for example. Doesn't seem like an impossible build to me, but it's just not an obvious pairing. And there is another challenge to consider. And that brings me to the elephant in the room that I haven't touched on up to now. Actually, it's 3 elephants. Those are the Druid, the Barbarian, and the Monk. So what am I talking about? Well, usually when I plan an optimized build, and I'm considering the multi-class options, I look at a class and I see what additional benefits that class can bring to the build. But these 3 classes tend to provide some additional challenges that you don't have with other classes. The Druid is the most obvious. Now, if your table rules that Druids can wear metal armor, then you might not know why I'm listing them at all. But the class features of the Druid include the phrase, Druids will not wear armor or use shields made of metal. This is listed as a class feature. Big quotation marks on feature. Now, you might be thinking, hey, if I'm playing a wizard or a sorcerer, I might not be proficient in armor, and then I can't wear metal armor anyway, so what's the big deal? But when we're talking about Druid, it is different, because what is written here is a prohibition. This isn't a lack of proficiency or the lack of the ability to wear metal armor. This is, you will not wear metal armor. So it's going to carry over when we multiclass. Now, I understand, there's a lot of my viewers who think this rule is dumb. They think it's outdated. They don't use it. And I totally understand. However, it is written in the rules. So if we're playing by the rules, Druids have a prohibition against wearing metal armor. That carries over when we multiclass, and that is a huge disadvantage. Now, there is always the possibility, and I've seen this a lot, that your DM might say that you can have plate armor made of wood or bone or dragon hide or whatever, but the armor's in the player's handbook, which is probably all we can count on unless our DM says otherwise. Specify which armors are made of metal. Armors like studded leather or ring mail don't specify that they're made of metal. But chain shirt, scale mail, breastplate, half plate, chainmail, splint, and plate, which covers all but the absolute worst medium and heavy armors, by the way, specifically say they are made, at least in part, with metal right in the descriptions. I'm probably on side with the DM who says that half plate made of bone or wood is going to be absolutely terrible armor. If we want to be even a little bit realistic, your Druid wearing wooden plate armor hit with an axe should be chopped into pieces like firewood. So for my builds at least, I assume the rule for Druids and armor exists as it's written. Now, the issues with Barbarians and Monks aren't quite as pronounced as that, but they're issues nonetheless. So Barbarians, like I said previously, are the only class that really needs strength. What I didn't mention is they can't even throw a weapon using strength properly. This means not only are they restricted to strength, but they're restricted to melee and strength. Like if I want to make a melee fighter, I at least have the option to use a finesse weapon without invalidating my class features, and I could still draw a bow and be decent at that. But with a Barbarian, no choice. You must use strength, and even if you throw a weapon, well then it's not a melee weapon attack anymore, then you lose out your rage bonus for damage, you lose out your ability to make reckless attacks. I should mention that you can't rage in heavy armor either. Or I guess technically speaking, you can rage, you just don't get any benefits. And then of course there's the restriction on rage and spell casting. If you're raging, you can't cast spells, and you can't concentrate on spells. So not being able to cast means you won't be casting in combat. Not being able to concentrate means that most spells you might cast before combat aren't going to work either. So those things combined make Barbarian multiclassing far more limited. Barbarian works with melee fighters just fine, but with pretty much anything else, it's a much harder fit. And then the Monk. So at level 1 we get martial arts as our primary class feature, and that feature only works if you aren't wearing armor or shield. What this means is, if we want to use martial arts, then we must rely on unarmored defense. But unarmored defense relies on our wisdom and our dexterity. So unless we have the exact same abilities, score, priorities with whatever class we multiclass into with Monk, we're going to have a problem with our armor class, or we're going to have to give up using martial arts. However, let's say we grab some Monk and we're playing a dexterity and wisdom class anyways, like maybe a Druid. So with unarmored defense, well, we're giving up a shield, and that hurts, but our armor class still might be passable. Well, then we have the bigger problem, and that is that the problem that the Monk uses unarmed strikes. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a video of the various issues with straight Monk and unarmed strikes. I've gone over all that before. No, let's talk about how terrible unarmed strikes are in regards to multiclassing. It all comes down to one thing. Your fists are not deadly weapons. Your fists aren't considered weapons at all by the rules. So any feature or spell that requires a weapon does not work with unarmed strikes. Side note, if you're looking for downvotes, go on Reddit and find a post where they complain that unarmed strikes should be considered weapons and post, unarmed literally means you aren't using a weapon. As you can see, that was really popular. First response, what? This is unfair. How can it count as a weapon attack but not a weapon? Now, if you think it's unfair that the literal definition of unarmed is not using a weapon, I mean, don't blame me. I didn't create the English language. So how can it count as a weapon attack? Well, stupid rule alert. By the rules, an attack with a melee weapon and a melee weapon attack are two entirely different things. I know it makes no sense, but don't blame me. I also didn't write the rules. An attack with a melee weapon refers to an attack made with a melee weapon, which unarmed strikes are not. While a melee weapon attack refers to a melee attack that isn't a spell attack, which unarmed strikes are. So, in simple terms, if it says melee weapon attack, we're okay. Otherwise, if it says we need a weapon, we're screwed. Let's run down what a disaster this is in regards to multiclassing. There's some features that specify melee weapon attack, and those are okay as long as they never reference a weapon. Starting with Artificer, big surprise. Enhanced weapon requires a weapon. Radiant weapon, nope, screwed. What about the gauntlets with armor? Nope, those are considered simple melee weapons. If we attack with a weapon, then it is not an unarmed strike. Though I guess our gauntlets could be considered monk weapons. What about Divine Smite? It says melee weapon attack, and that is the right wording for it to work. But no, because then it says down here that Divine Smite adds to a weapon's damage. And so it does refer to a weapon. And yes, this has been confirmed by sage advice that it doesn't work with unarmed strikes for this very reason. And no, improved Divine Smite offers no reprieve. The Devotion Paladin's Sacred Weapon doesn't work. Even the Oathbreaker's Aura of Hate doesn't work. Rogues. I mean, if we attack with dexterity, we can use sneak attack, right? Nope. Sneak attack can only be made with a finesse weapon or a ranged weapon. Needless to say, your unarmed strikes won't be your warlock's pact weapon either. But Moon Druid. Surely, a bear's attacks aren't using weapons, so they count as unarmed strikes, right? Well, this is weird, but bear's attacks are natural weapons. A bear's claws and bite are weapons. Your fists, not so much. It's even worse because natural weapons aren't monk weapons. So if you use them at all, you can't even make your unarmed strike. And obviously spells like Magic Weapon and Hunter's Mark, they're not going to work either. It is ugly, folks. It's ugly. And we haven't even gone into the problems with needing Dexterity, Wisdom, and Constitution on the base class before multiclassing. And since monks have multiple minimum ability score requirements for multiclassing, unless we're multiclassing with another class with at least one of those requirements, it's going to make ability scores a serious challenge. So monks, barbarians, druids especially, we tend not to see just randomly thrown with other classes. So why all this talk about multiclasses we seldom see and why we seldom see them? I've always said that it's concept first and then optimize, but I have also always said that with reskinning, you can optimize any concept. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's what optimization is. It's taking a concept, then find the mechanics that bring it to life. And that has served me well. And then I'm sitting down and I think of a pun, and I think, Barbarian sounds a little bit like Barbarian. Now that's not a concept, but a fun little play on words that absolutely requires Bard and Barbarian. So I thought, you know what? Bard and Barbarian, they do not mix well. This is probably not worth me exploring. Go to bed, silly. And I tried to stop myself, but my brain suddenly started working backwards. And instead of finding the class mix to fit my concept, instead I was thinking of a concept to fit my class mix. Oh no! And the puns, they wouldn't stop. They kept filling my brain. And suddenly, it was there. The perfect pun. And I could not fall asleep because, you know, I now had to make this build. I had to make the Barbarian.
I pity the fool who cannot see 1 and 1 makes 2, 2 and 1 makes 3. It was destiny.
So in my next video, I will present what may become a reoccurring thing.
Frankenbuilds.
I hope you'll join me. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.